It has been more than 20 years since the week I spent stationed at the lookout tower in the White River National Forest. But even now, when the cold season begins to creep in and the trees stand bare against the gray sky, the memory returns to me with the same vivid clarity as though it happened only yesterday. And the thought of it still chills me in a way that no winter wind ever could. At the time, I was young and untested, eager to prove myself to the senior rangers who already carried the quiet confidence of men who had lived through storms and wildfires. And when I was assigned to the fire lookout tower on the ridge, I felt a sense of pride and anticipation, thinking only of the solitude, the clean mountain air, and the chance to demonstrate that I could handle myself alone in the wilderness without fear or complaint. The tower itself stood like a sentinel above the endless forest below, an old but sturdy wooden structure with weathered beams and windows that looked out in every direction, offering a breathtaking view of snow-dusted peaks and the dense green canopy of pines that stretched to the horizon without end. And though the hike up to it was long and arduous, my legs aching as I climbed the switchbacks with a heavy pack, I felt almost triumphant when I unlocked the door and stepped inside, claiming the little room at the top as my own temporary domain. For the first 3 days, life up there was everything I had imagined it would be, and I settled quickly into a routine of scanning the ridges for smoke through the binoculars, logging the wind conditions and temperatures every hour in the battered notebook they had left for me, brewing myself weak coffee on the tiny camp stove, and sitting in the evenings on the narrow cot with a book in my lap while the wind whispered outside and the last light of day painted the mountains in shades of gold and rose. At night, as I lay wrapped in my sleeping bag, I would listen to the gentle groan of the timbers and the occasional distant call of an owl, and I would think that I could happily spend much longer than a week in that quiet and beautiful place, where no human voice or engine noise reached me, and the only company I needed was the whisper of the forest below. On the 4th night, however, something happened that would forever change the way I thought of that tower and of the wilderness itself. Something that even now I cannot explain nor entirely forget, no matter how many times I tell myself it must have been a trick of the mind or of the cold mountain air. I awoke suddenly from an uneasy sleep, and although there was no particular sound that I could identify as having disturbed me, I was instantly aware of a strange heaviness in the air, a kind of oppressive stillness that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. And as I sat up on the cot, rubbing my eyes and trying to shake the fog of sleep, I became aware of just how cold the room had become, far colder than any night before, with a kind of penetrating chill that made my breath rise in pale clouds toward the dark ceiling. At first, I assumed I must have left the door or one of the windows ajar, but when I stood and checked, I saw that everything was sealed as tightly as I had left it the night before. And it was then, as I turned back toward the center of the room, that I noticed the windows themselves. Every single pane of glass was covered in thick white frost, not just at the corners or in delicate fern-like patterns as I might have expected in winter, but solidly coated from top to bottom, as though an invisible hand had swept a sheet of ice across the entire structure in the dead of night. And in the moonlight that filtered dimly through the glass, the frost glittered faintly, its strange, jagged patterns catching the light like tiny blades. I stepped closer, confused and uneasy, and that was when my eyes fell upon the first handprint, pressed clearly into the frost. A large, human-looking hand, with fingers spread wide, standing out starkly against the otherwise unbroken white sheet of ice. And although my mind at first struggled to make sense of what I was seeing, telling me it was perhaps just the mark of my own hand from the previous day, I realized quickly that the print was on the outside of the glass, where I could not possibly have reached. As my gaze swept around the room, I saw more of them. Not just a single set of fingers, but many, pressed against nearly every window, some higher than others, some closer together, as though a circle of figures had surrounded the tower during the night and leaned close to watch me while I slept, leaving behind the ghostly impressions of their hands in the frost. My stomach turned cold as I stood there staring. And in that moment of stunned silence, I saw something that made my knees go weak. The prints began to move, slowly but unmistakably, as though unseen fingers were dragging down through the frost, smearing it as they slid lower toward the sills. And then, even as I watched in disbelief, more prints appeared on another pane, then another, moving in deliberate arcs around the room, circling me as though whatever was out there was walking round and round the tower, never pausing, never stopping, but always keeping its hands pressed flat to the glass as it passed each window. My first instinct was to reach for the radio and call for help, but when I pressed the button, there was no sound at all, not even the faint static that usually crackled from the speaker. And when I glanced down at my wristwatch to check the time, I saw that its hands, too, had frozen. Both of them stuck at precisely 2:11 a.m., no matter how hard I tapped the glass or tried to wind it. For the rest of that long, bitter night, I remained seated on the edge of the cot, clutching the small knife I carried, though knowing in my heart it would do me no good. My eyes darting from one window to the next as the faint silhouettes of those prints slid down and reappeared elsewhere, over and over again, until the very first light of dawn began to creep across the floorboards, and the frost finally began to thin and melt away. When the sun had risen high enough to paint the mountains in gold, and the windows had cleared to reveal nothing but the familiar sweep of green forest below, I packed my belongings as quickly as my shaking hands would allow, left the tower exactly as I had found it, locked the door behind me without daring to look back, and hiked down the mountain in silence, too afraid to think, too exhausted to feel anything but a bone-deep need to leave that place behind me. When I finally reached the ranger station and filed my report, expecting perhaps ridicule or reprimand for abandoning my post before my shift was complete, the supervisor only regarded me with a long, measured look before opening the station logbook to a nearly empty page, where, scrawled in uneven and hurried handwriting, a single line had been left by someone before me, a warning that read simply, "Do not stay past the third night." From that day on, they never sent another ranger to stay overnight at that tower again, leaving it locked and deserted, surrendered to the snow and the wind, a silent witness to whatever still lingers there on those icy nights. And though I have often wondered what it was that came to the windows that night, circling me again and again, and though I have told myself 1,000 stories in search of an explanation that would make it easier to sleep, the truth remains that there are some places where the mountains hold their secrets close, and there are some things that do not like to be watched by human eyes. That is all I can say, and I have never set foot in that tower again, nor do I ever intend to. In the fall of 2017, during my second assignment as a seasonal ranger at Olympic National Park, I was sent on a solo patrol through one of the park's more isolated loops. a long, heavily forested stretch that branched off from the upper Ho River Valley and rarely saw visitors outside of the peak summer months. The weather had been unsettled that week. Intermittent rain showers, heavy cloud cover, and an early morning fog that seemed determined to cling to the treetops long after the sun had risen. So it wasn't surprising that the trail felt deserted that day. And as I made my way deeper into the back country, I found myself walking for hours without hearing or seeing any signs of human presence at all. That portion of the forest, even in good light, carries a weight to it. There's an ancient, pressing quiet that seems to soak into your skin the longer you stay, as if the trees are not simply growing, but watching, holding their breath just beyond your field of vision. And while I've always had a healthy respect for that kind of atmosphere, I never felt uneasy in it until the moment I noticed something out of place. I had just crested a slight incline along a bend in the trail when I became aware, not of a sound or a sudden movement, but of a presence, something that didn't belong, or at the very least, hadn't been there moments before. About 50 yards off the trail, through a veil of moss-covered branches and half-shrouded by one of the massive spruce trees that populate the area, I saw what appeared to be a man standing perfectly still. His figure was partially obscured by the surrounding foliage, but it was clear enough to see that he was wearing an old, weather-faded green parka that hung slightly too loose on his frame, and a pair of jeans that looked damp and heavy, the lower legs darkened with water and dirt. He was facing in my direction, or at least his body was angled that way. But he wasn't moving, wasn't signaling, and made no attempt to approach or speak. At first, I considered the most logical explanation, that he might be a hiker who had wandered off the trail and lost his bearings, or someone camping illegally in the woods. But something about his posture didn't match the scenario. He stood with a kind of motionless intent that felt neither panicked nor relaxed. And although he wasn't making eye contact in the way a person usually does, I had the distinct impression that he was aware of me and had been watching long before I noticed him. There was no urgency in the way he stood, no attempt to wave for help or even to acknowledge my presence with a nod or gesture. Just complete, deliberate stillness, as though he had been waiting for something and I had arrived too early or too late to understand what. I adjusted my footing on the trail, shifting my stance slightly to try and get a better view without appearing threatening. And I began to step off the path with measured caution, intending to make contact or at least offer assistance if needed. But as soon as I took those first few steps into the brush, the figure moved. Not in a hurried or alarmed fashion, but with one smooth, almost effortless step backward into the undergrowth, disappearing behind the tree without sound, without cracking a branch or rustling a single leaf. By the time I reached the area where he'd been standing, the space was empty, and the only thing that remained was the oppressive hush of the forest and the heavy, damp air pressing in from all sides. I searched the surrounding brush carefully, widening my radius in slow spirals to see if I could find any indication of where he might have gone. Any footprints left in the wet soil, any disturbed moss, snapped twigs, or compressed patches of fern that might suggest someone had passed through. But the forest floor looked completely undisturbed, as if no one had walked there in days, if not longer. The trees were so densely packed in that stretch that anyone trying to move through would have had to force a path. And yet, there was no evidence of anyone having done so. It was as if the man had simply stepped backward and vanished into the trees, swallowed whole by the landscape. Although the encounter left me with an uneasy feeling I couldn't quite shake, I eventually convinced myself that I must have been mistaken. that what I'd seen had been a trick of the light or a misinterpretation of shape and shadow, brought on by the fog, the silence, and the long hours of solitude. It's not uncommon for your mind to start filling in blanks when you've been alone in the woods for extended periods. And I'd been out there since morning, with no one to speak to and little in the way of auditory cues to keep me grounded. I made a quick note in my field log about the sighting. Possible individual off-trail near marker 18B. No contact made, no evidence of activity found. And then I finished my patrol as planned, working my way back toward the access road where my vehicle was parked. By the time I reached the service lot, the light had begun to fade, filtered through a solid ceiling of low gray clouds that hung close over the treetops. My vehicle sat exactly where I'd left it earlier that morning, pulled just off the gravel shoulder with its tires partially sunk into soft mud from the previous night's rain. Everything appeared untouched. The windows fogged with condensation, the body of the car coated in a fine mist and pine debris. And I remember feeling a small but distinct sense of relief at the sight of it. A subtle affirmation that the strange tension I had felt earlier was nothing more than my imagination running too far ahead of me. I moved to the back of the vehicle to stow my gear and was just about to open the hatch when I saw it. A single, smeared handprint on the inside of the rear window. The glass was clouded with condensation from the temperature difference, and the print had cleared a portion of it. Palm down, fingers spread slightly, and dragged downward in a slow, deliberate smear that ended about halfway down the pane. It was unmistakably fresh. The size of the hand suggested an adult, and the moisture that had been wiped away hadn't yet reformed, which meant it had been left recently, certainly after I had departed that morning. The real problem was not that the handprint was there at all, but rather that it was on the interior side of the glass. I stood there for a long time, motionless, trying to reason through it. Going over the steps I had taken before leaving, mentally reviewing the process of locking the vehicle, checking whether I had opened the back at any point during the day, and confirming with sinking certainty that I had not. I hadn't returned to the vehicle at all until that moment, and no one else had access. Nothing inside had been disturbed. My radio was still powered off and sitting exactly where I had left it on the passenger seat. My backpack was sealed and untouched. The field log was tucked into its sleeve on the dashboard, still dry, still unread. Everything was in place, except for that handprint. I didn't report it. I didn't take a photograph or mention it in the final log. I didn't tell my supervisor when I returned to the station, and I didn't include it in the week's summary notes. I wasn't afraid, not in the immediate sense, not of being attacked or followed. But I felt something colder, heavier, and much harder to articulate. A kind of creeping certainty that someone or something had been with me that day without my knowing. That print was not an accident, and it wasn't a leftover from the morning. It was fresh, recent, deliberate, and whoever left it had done so without leaving any other trace. It wasn't the sighting itself that haunted me in the weeks that followed. Not the man in the parka, not the vanishing act, not even the soundless disappearance in the forest. What stayed with me, what I still think about when I drive through that part of the park, or when the mist hangs too low across the tree line, was the handprint, that slow, muddy smear left on the one place I thought I was safe. I don't know who he was. I don't know how he disappeared without a sound. And I don't know how he managed to get inside my vehicle. or whether he ever truly left the forest at all. But for at least part of that day, I was being watched, and I had no idea. I never truly expected that I would one day sit down and commit this particular memory to paper. Not because I felt obligated to protect some kind of institutional secrecy or preserve my own reputation, but rather because doing so would mean acknowledging that it had actually happened. That it was not a fragment of dream logic or the twisted recollection of a fatigued mind deep in the wilderness. It was easier, at the time, to box the memory away inside some unmarked corner of my thoughts, and to convince myself that if I simply left it alone long enough, it would lose its weight, its shape, maybe even its voice. But the truth, as I've come to understand it in the years since, is that some memories do not fade with distance or soften over time. They only grow sharper in the silence. In September of 2009, during the closing weeks of a long, damp Alaskan summer, I was stationed deep in the southeastern quadrant of the Tongass National Forest, a place known not just for its immense swaths of untouched temperate rainforest, but for the way it seems to swallow sound and compress time. I had been in that region for several seasons by then, long enough to recognize the subtle shift in atmosphere that occurs before a cold front settles in or when certain animals begin to migrate early. And I was comfortable working the remote assignments that most others didn't want. The long solo stretches where the only companions were fog, pine needles, and the low, constant groan of ancient trees leaning in the wind. The incident that sent us into the forest that time was not particularly remarkable on paper. A series of reports submitted by campers and hikers over the course of about 2 weeks, each citing distressing sounds in the night that had caused enough concern for them to abandon their camps and, in one case, leave a significant portion of their gear behind in order to hike out before sunrise. 3 separate groups, unknown to one another, all described the sound as a human scream. Not a shout or a startled yell, but a sustained, blood-curdling scream that began and ended without warning and seemed to carry through the trees in a pattern that none of them could explain. One pair of campers claimed that the screaming had lasted for more than an hour, and they insisted that it had moved in a wide arc around their tent in the darkness, though they had never seen the source. Another report, from a solo backpacker who arrived at a nearby ranger station, visibly shaken and unwilling to answer questions, contained only 2 hand-scrawled sentences on the incident form. "There's something wrong out there. It knows where you are." It was that final line that convinced the district supervisor to authorize a Level 2 deployment, which meant we were to enter the area, monitor for signs of predatory activity, and file a formal report, but with the understanding that we were not, under any circumstances, to escalate or provoke whatever might be out there unless we could confirm it posed a wide threat to human life. I was partnered for that deployment with Ranger Daniel Matheson, a reliable and even-tempered man in his early 40s who had joined the service after a decade in the Army and had earned a reputation for being steady under pressure, skeptical of exaggeration, and refreshingly unshaken by the usual superstitions that often surrounded assignments in isolated areas. He and I had worked together before, and we shared an unspoken rhythm in the field that came from mutual respect and a shared understanding that nature, while unpredictable, rarely acted without cause. We reached the designated area in the early afternoon, after hiking nearly 6 hours through dense, uneven terrain, guided by a combination of old map notations and a few faded trail markings that hadn't been maintained in years. The terrain itself felt oppressive, not because of any visible danger, but because of the sheer density of the vegetation. The way the trees pressed in on all sides like curious onlookers, and the ever-present, low-hanging fog that clung to our boots and coiled around our ankles as we moved. When we arrived at the site most frequently mentioned in the reports, a narrow ridge just below the tree line, overlooking a shallow basin, the first thing we both noticed, almost simultaneously, was the lack of ambient noise. There were no bird calls, no rustling of squirrels in the underbrush, no insect drone hovering beneath the branches, only the soft sound of our own breathing and the crunch of pine needles beneath our feet. For seasoned rangers like us, that absence of sound was not merely eerie, it was deeply unnatural. In a healthy forest, even at night, there's always something moving, something chittering or chirping or breathing. But this place felt sterile, as if something had pressed the mute button on the entire ecosystem. We set up camp just before sunset, establishing a small perimeter using motion sensors and placing a thermal imaging unit on a tripod facing the deepest part of the tree line. Neither of us said much during setup, but I noticed the way Matheson kept glancing toward the trees, as if expecting to catch something standing between them. Not out of fear necessarily, but with the kind of alertness that comes from instinct honed over years of experience. The air had a strange stillness to it, not like the calm before a storm, but like the stillness inside an old church, long after everyone's gone home. Quiet, yes, but not empty. The first sound came at exactly 2:32 a.m., cutting through the forest like a jagged blade. I had been half awake in my sleeping bag, listening to the faint rustling of the canvas tent in the breeze, when the scream tore through the night. High-pitched, human in timbre, but so exaggerated and distorted that it almost sounded mechanical, like a recording that had been stretched too far and was beginning to tear at the edges. It didn't trail off the way most screams do. Instead, it cut off abruptly, as if the source had been yanked backward mid-breath. Then, moments later, another scream erupted from a different direction, followed by a third, and then a fourth. All similar in sound, all eerily identical in cadence and pitch, each one seeming to come from a different corner of the woods. We emerged from the tent with our gear at the ready, Matheson scanning the area with a flashlight, while I swept with the thermal scope. The screams had stopped by then, but the silence that followed was even worse than the noise had been. I could hear my own heartbeat, heavy in my ears, and beneath that, another sound began to rise. Footsteps, large and deliberate, moving quickly around the perimeter of our camp in a wide arc that passed just beyond the range of our lantern's beam. The pattern of the footsteps was unlike anything I'd ever heard in the wild. They were too evenly spaced to belong to a four-legged animal, too heavy and deliberate to be human, and too fast to be natural. As if something massive was pacing with intent, circling us while remaining just out of reach. Then, with no warning, a branch cracked loudly somewhere just to the east of the tent, no more than 15 feet away. Matheson moved first, stepping forward and sweeping the flashlight toward the trees. I followed with the thermal scope, adjusting for range. And that was when I saw it, or part of it. It stood between two massive trees, motionless and partially obscured by shadow, but close enough that I could make out its shape in full. It was tall, impossibly so, at least 8 feet, maybe more, and so thin that its limbs looked like they could snap if bent too far. Its posture was wrong, its body slightly hunched and slanted forward, like it had learned how to stand by watching something else do it. The skin was pale, almost bluish in the light, but uneven, as if stretched too tightly across a frame that was never meant to wear it. But the most disturbing detail, the one that has stayed with me longest, was its face, or rather, its lack of one. Where the face should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin. No eyes, no mouth, no nostrils. Nothing to suggest expressions or identity, yet somehow it still managed to communicate that it was looking directly at us. Not with curiosity, but with absolute, consuming attention. It didn't move. It didn't retreat. It simply stepped backward, slowly and silently, into the darkness between the trees. And then it was gone, swallowed by the forest, as if it had never been there to begin with. We broke camp well before dawn, moving quickly and without discussion. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. The air felt heavier on the hike out, as though the forest itself had become aware of us in some small but significant way. Back at the station, we filed the report as required, marking it as a predator-related anomaly and citing possible bear mimicry behavior. Though we both knew that no bear, no animal at all, could have made those sounds or moved in the way that thing had moved. Matheson requested a transfer not long after. I stayed on another season, but I avoided that sector of the forest from that point forward, not out of superstition, but out of respect. Some places are not meant to be revisited. And now, many years later, the memory has not softened. If anything, it has deepened, solidified, become something fixed in my understanding of what the wilderness can hold. I have heard 1,000 sounds in the forest: owls, coyotes, mountain lions, wind playing tricks with stone and wood. But none of them have ever sounded like that scream. Nothing in the natural world prepares you for the moment when you realize that what you are hearing is not simply unfamiliar, but impossible. Sometimes, in the dead quiet of early morning, when even the crickets have gone still and the wind hasn't yet stirred the trees, I think I can hear it again. That voice, that scream, echoing faintly from somewhere far off, circling just beyond memory. And when I do, I wonder not whether I imagined it, but whether it ever really left at all. Back in the fall of 2007, during the early weeks of September, when the humidity had just begun to ease and the forest was starting its slow turn toward autumn, I was sent into a remote and lightly patrolled section of the Ozark National Forest to perform a standard round of solo trail maintenance. This was not an unusual assignment for someone in my position, as I had spent the better part of 2 decades working for the Forest Service. And solo deployments into the more isolated areas of the park had become a routine part of my professional rhythm. There was a quiet consistency to those kinds of days, one spent in silence, surrounded only by trees and old ridgelines, where the distant hum of insects and the crunch of boots on dry pine needles often marked the only passing of time. The location I was sent to on that particular week had not seen much foot traffic in recent years. It lay well beyond the more popular hiking routes, past where the usual signage ended, beyond even where most hunters bothered to wander. The service road that led in had eroded unevenly over time, making it inaccessible to anything but 4-wheel drive vehicles and work rigs. And even then, only when the weather cooperated. My assignment involved inspecting old blaze markings, clearing minor debris, and making note of any trail washout or encroaching brush that might render the road unsafe in the coming months. once the rains began. I packed accordingly, as always, with a full field kit, extra water, a topographic map, GPS, medical supplies, and my standard-issue Winchester, which we were instructed to carry during solo excursions into remote territory, not because there was an active expectation of danger, but because the forest has its own rules. And it was never wise to assume safety simply because you were familiar with your surroundings. The morning passed without anything particularly notable. I worked my way along the southern slope of a ridgeline where the forest was denser and the canopy higher, casting long bands of shadow that shifted as the sun climbed. The trail itself was in reasonable condition, though it bore signs of age. Tree roots pushing up through the earth in places, moss taking hold across sections of trail that had clearly not been disturbed in quite some time. I cleared a few fallen branches, remarked several faded blazes on tree trunks with fresh orange paint, and noted a sagging wooden footbridge further up the trail that would likely need replacement before winter. Everything felt as it should. Quiet, unhurried, predictable. The kind of workday that allowed a person's mind to drift comfortably into its own thoughts. It was shortly after midday, when the sun had begun its slow descent and the shadows were beginning to stretch across the gulches, that I paused near a break in the tree line overlooking a shallow valley. The overlook wasn't dramatic, nothing like the scenic vistas on the park's brochures, but it offered a clear view of the tree canopy below, which appeared denser and darker in the hollow. I remember taking a drink of water while leaning against a smooth, moss-covered rock and noting how unusually still the woods had become. At first, I attributed the quiet to the time of day, as it wasn't uncommon for bird and insect activity to dip in the early afternoon. But the longer I stood there, the more it struck me that the silence was not just ambient. It was absolute. There were no distant woodpecker taps, no cicadas droning from the branches, no skittering in the leaves. The forest had fallen into a kind of hush that felt deliberate, as though something had pressed pause on the world around me. And then, quite suddenly, I heard it. Somewhere farther down the slope, beyond the tree line in the valley below, a voice rang out. Not loudly, but with a distinct human cadence that cut cleanly through the still air. It was a voice calling for help. And yet the moment I heard it, a deep and involuntary unease took hold of me, because the voice was not simply familiar, it was identical to my own. Every intonation, every subtle nuance of how the words were pronounced matched me exactly. From the slight rasp I developed in my throat that week from a lingering cold, down to the very rhythm of how I typically projected my voice across distances. The words themselves were straightforward, a cry for assistance, a call for attention. But it was not the message that unsettled me. It was the way in which it was delivered, as though I were somehow listening to a perfect recording of myself projected from somewhere just out of sight. I hadn't spoken a word aloud since leaving my vehicle earlier that morning, and in that moment, I was entirely certain I remained alone. Still, I scanned the valley below with slow, deliberate motion, trying to identify any movement or glint of sunlight that might indicate the presence of another person. But the forest held its stillness, unmoved and soundless except for that voice. I did not respond. Instead, I stood motionless, listening intently as a long, empty pause followed the first call. Then the voice returned. It had drawn closer, and while the tone remained the same, still my own, still unmistakable, the phrasing had changed. The new words carried less urgency, as though whoever or whatever was speaking had grown more confident in how they were delivering the sound. But something in the spacing of the words was slightly off. There were gaps between each phrase, unnatural pauses that suggested the speaker was not merely repeating what it had heard, but rather piecing it together from memory, like assembling fragments of overheard language into something it hoped would pass for communication. By now, the unease had deepened into something more primal, a quiet, crawling dread that did not cause panic, but rooted itself in the base of my spine. I unshouldered my rifle slowly, with measured intention, keeping it low and ready without raising it. Not because I intended to fire, but because some part of me understood, with instinctive clarity, that this was not a situation that could be dismissed as mere confusion or coincidence. What followed was stranger still. The voice, still carrying my tone and rhythm, began to say things I had never said, not aloud at least. The phrases were broken, partial, almost dreamlike, and yet unmistakably familiar in the way that thoughts are familiar when they rise from somewhere just behind conscious memory. These were not commands or warnings, but instead the kind of quiet thoughts that pass through a person's mind in the moments between sleep and waking. Strange internal noticings I had kept entirely to myself. Short sentences I remembered thinking while lying in bed at the ranger station alone. Phrases like acknowledgments of being watched or uncertain admissions that I had heard things I couldn't explain. I never recorded those thoughts. I never spoke them aloud. But here they were, returned to me in my own voice, spoken just out of sight among the trees. I began to move, not quickly, not carelessly. I backed away from the overlook and returned to the trail, stepping carefully so as not to snap branches or rustle too loudly. I didn't look back. I didn't call out. I kept my eyes forward, watching the path and the perimeter of the trees. And that was when I caught sight of something to my right, just beyond a narrow bend in the trail. A sliver of movement between two trees, brief and deliberate. Whatever it was, ducked behind the wide trunk of a hickory tree, just as I turned my head. But I saw enough to know it was tall, taller than any adult human I'd encountered in the field. And it was thin in a way that defied normal anatomy. The limbs I glimpsed in that flash of motion were elongated, the joints set at angles that suggested a skeletal structure not quite suited to upright motion. And the skin, if it was skin, appeared pallid, like something preserved in darkness. I didn't pursue it. I didn't try to get a better look. I simply kept moving, always forward, never increasing speed beyond a careful pace. As I walked, the voice continued behind me for a time, but it had begun to degrade. The words lost their shape, breaking into partial syllables, garbled sounds, the rhythm unraveling until all that remained was the hollow echo of something pretending to be human and failing. It didn't call after me in desperation. It simply dwindled, receding like a bad signal, or like breath slowly leaving a room. The forest remained quiet during my retreat. I passed no animals, heard no branches snapping. The trail in front of me never changed, but the atmosphere held that unnatural stillness all the way back to the higher ridge, where the radio signal gradually began to return. My handheld device crackled back to life with intermittent bursts of static, followed by the faint, ordinary hum of wind across the microphone. It was the first truly normal sound I had heard in what felt like hours. I did not stop to reflect until I was well beyond that section of forest. And even then, I found no language to explain what had happened. Only the undeniable certainty that something had been there. Something that could listen and repeat and follow with a voice that wasn't its own.